Hi, communication ethicist, Dr. Sloan here, and this will be your Module 4 walkthrough video. I am going to talk about the assignments that are due this week in Module 4. I'm going to pronounce and overview the chapters in the legalism section of our text, and I'm going to talk about our ethical manifesto paper that each of you will be writing this week. So Module 4 will feel a little bit different than what we have typically been doing. There's still reading of the text, there's still discussion, and you do have a summary and application, but this week you only have to do one chapter summary and application, and I've told you what chapter it has to be on. So you will read 3 chapters, but you only have to write the summary and application for one of those chapters. And that is because you'll spend the majority of your week in terms of completing an assignment on the big ethical manifesto paper that I will talk about in a little bit. So please be clear that even though you have to read 3 chapters, you have to take in the knowledge, and the discussion board will help you with that as well. You only have to write a summary / application for chapter 20. Okay, so again, chapter 20, that's it. And then you'll spend the rest on your paper. For reading this week, you must read chapter 19, chapter 20, and then you will select a chapter of your choice from part 4 of the textbook. And part 4 is the legalism or legalist stance. So this is a rules-based approach. There has to be specific law laid out, and then we are to follow that law. So the options in chapter 4 are in terms of option, I mean, what chapter can you choose to read, or what chapter have you been assigned? Chapter 18, written by Peck, 2009, addresses Plato's ethics, and the chapter is titled Elite Norms. And because Plato is the student of Socrates, actually a lot of Plato's, especially his early writings, are basically reliving conversations and learning with Socrates. And so it's kind of an interesting, I think Plato is one of the most kind of interesting of the chapters to fit under legalism. But he is categorized under legalism probably most specifically because he does have 3 big, clear virtues that he identifies, and then he tells readers or listeners that to be ethical, you have to live in moderation of those virtues or those extremes. And that is similar to what Aristotle taught in his doctrine of the mean, right? So don't be overly hilarious, and don't be super dry in terms of personality, but you want to live in the middle. So that's Aristotle's doctrine of the mean, and Plato kind of, as the student of Socrates, lives that out and has his 3 main virtues and encourages us to live in moderation of those. And what those virtues are spelled out in chapter 18. For chapter 19, everyone has been assigned to read Muhammad's honor-centered morality, and that is actually to expose some of us in the South to what a Muslim believer does believe, and what the less extreme views of that faith system teaches. So it might just be a helpful exposure for some of you. Of course, Muhammad is the central figure of the Islamic faith, and is the prophet for that faith system. In the Quran, which is a Muslim's holy book, teaches about ideological and civil matters. So it's neat because it's not just like here's conceptually how we're supposed to live, but of course there are very clear rules as well laid out about marriage, or justice, or just how you're supposed to get along with your neighbor or not live in debt, and things like that. They're spelled out in the Quran. And so all of that is addressed in chapter 19, which everyone is required to read. And then chapter 20 is written again by Peck, 2009, and this is Immanuel Kant. And Kant, along with one of our chapter 1 theories, Mill's utilitarianism, Kant's categorical imperative is the other huge theory that anyone that has studied ethics is going to be familiar with. So you have to understand Mill's utilitarianism that we studied in week 1 and we wrote a discussion about and we summarized. And then you have to understand Kant's categorical imperative, which is why chapter 20 is required for reading, and chapter 20 is what you are required to write your summary and application of. And Kant's categorical imperative is an argument that we must categorically do the right thing, that in all situations, that's what the phrase categorically, in all situations, this is the right thing to do. And he has 2 basic rules in that, and he calls them maxims. Act only in a way that can become universal law, which means only do what could be repeated in every situation. So if you're going to lie, then can people in all situations, in all contexts, lie? Is it okay as universal law? If it's not okay in every context, then it would not be okay as universal law, and therefore would be unethical. And his second component of his formula, or his second maxim, is basically to treat other people with dignity, and which means do not treat them as a means to an end, but an end of themselves. That humans are dignified beings and not to be utilized to get to a certain end, which is very opposite of Machiavelli, whom we read about in week 2, where Machiavelli argues the ends justify the means. So if your end is to be successful or to be powerful or to make $3 million, then you can trample people along the way. And Kant argues exactly the opposite, that we never treat people as a means to an end, but as an end in and of themselves. So everyone, again, is required to read chapter 20. Chapter 21 is Moses, who is a well-known figure in the Christian Bible, and walked up on the mountain and got his slates of the 10 Commandments and came down and shared them to his fellow faith community. And so chapter 21 is written by Babcock, 2009, and is titled Deontological Norms. And that's because that phrase, deontological, is a rules-based, that there is a supreme or big G God or higher being that says, here's what we do. And the Decalogue is a phrase for 10, dec. So Decalogue are the 10 Commandments, and so it's kind of a fancy word for what we commonly refer to as the 10 Commandments. 10 very clear rules that must be followed. Makes sense that the Moses chapter is included in the legalism section of our text. And chapter 22 is about Hobbes. Ward 2009 titles the chapter The Ethics of Social Order. And Hobbes is included here in the legalist stance because he believes that for society to function well, every member of society must agree to have a powerful sovereign. So a leader that prevents society from basically being selfish or slipping into war. And so we need a good leader, and we need to agree to be under leadership, because I guess kind of in our natural state, we will seek our own interests only. So Hobbes kind of has a legalist position or stance there. So that's an overview of your options for part 4, and of course some pronunciations. The only one that might be difficult for you guys would be Immanuel Kant. And there's a great video about Kant that actually begins with some pronunciations, and you may or may not agree with those pronunciations. The last thing I want to address in this video is this week's Ethical Manifesto paper. I have pulled up for you. This is the assignment explanation that is included here in our course. This is a 5-page paper, which means 5 pages of double-spaced content. So this is not an intimidating amount of work. That's about 2.5 pages of actual writing, maybe 3. And you'll have an APA-style cover page, an APA-style reference page. There is a useful docs section that shows you, there's a video, there's an APA tips page, there's an actual APA example. All of that is included, so be sure that you're familiar with APA because you will be graded. You must have 2 academic sources. The textbook can count as 1. a Wikipedia source or some online encyclopedia is not an academic source. You need to find a credible academic college level source. And in this paper, you will have an introduction. So that means following good organizational content. Again, the useful doc section, overviews, how to write, a great introduction and a great conclusion. And then you will briefly summarize your own morals, which at the very least are the 3 rules that you shared in your outline. And then you will overview a chapter from the textbook and at least 3 rules from that chapter, that framework. Again, your outline has already done this for you. So this is the first part of the outline, this is the second part of the outline, and this is the third part of the outline from last week. So we're building on what we did last week in terms of basic outlining, and we're putting that into the paper, and now we're going to keep going. So what you outlined last week has to mesh together somehow. And some of you chose Jesus or your own morals, which have a lot to do with the Christian faith, and RAND, which is about seeking self. So if you are about serving others and then serving yourself or reaching your own self-interest, then how do those ideas come together to make one fluid, new ethical system? So that's your job here in this section of the paper, is to identify a name for your new framework that you are creating based on your morals, chapter selected from the textbook, second chapter selected from the textbook. So these 3 will culminate in a new framework that you will name, and then you will identify the rules and principles of that framework, which means you can pick and choose, you know, some of the rules from these various 3 and include those, or grow upon those, expand upon those in the new framework. And then you need to categorize it. Is this an altruistic framework? Is this a legalistic framework? So use some of the learning from the textbook in terms of these big words that we have been using to categorize. Then the next thing you'll do is you'll share a dilemma, and you may use a dilemma from one of the templates, or you can develop your own. If you develop your own, it has to be where neither of the options are great. So a dilemma is not, should the person cheat on their spouse and be unhappy because their spouse divorces them, or cheat and be happy for a moment. I mean, those are clearly, like, one option is clearly better than the other. So the point of a dilemma is that both of the options are not exactly great or clearly the way to go. So if you cannot write your own dilemma, then you may absolutely use one of the dilemmas from the template or build upon one of the dilemmas from the template. So quickly share the dilemma, and then you need to apply this new framework that you created to the dilemma, just like we've been doing in your weekly summary. So what 2 or more rules from this new framework can be applied to this dilemma that's written, and then what is the conclusion? What is the best choice from the dilemma options based on the framework? So just like we've been doing, you'll do that in paragraph form, not bullets. You're writing an APA style paper here as the dilemma portion of the paper. And the last thing you'll do in terms of new content in your paper is you will critique your new framework. What is good about it? What is not good about it? What parts fit, and what ethical questions are still unanswered? Of course, you'll finish your APA style paper with a conclusion, and then you must have an APA style reference page. So this is what's expected of you this week. I'm going to post this video as an announcement, and you can reply to this announcement with questions similar, so that other people can learn from your question and maybe their question will be answered. Or you can email me if you have questions as you get into writing this APA style paper this week. I'm looking forward to your ethical thoughts, and I'm especially excited to see each of your ethical manifesto and what that framework looks like. Good luck.